Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Jennifer Hanley, and I am a planetary scientist at Lowell Observatory. I am also the Science Organizing Committee Chair for this year's Division for Planetary Sciences meeting. So today we have Dr. Adam Frank. Planetary Sciences meeting. So today we have Dr. Adam Frank. Meeting. So today we have Dr. Adam Frank. Sorry, I'm getting a echo here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences Carl Sagan Medal recognizes and honors outstanding communication by an active planetary scientist to the general public. It is awarded to scientists whose efforts have significantly contributed to a public understanding of and enthusiasm for planetary science. Astrophysicist Adam Frank is a leading expert on the final stages of evolution for stars like the sun. His computational research group at the University of Rochester develops advanced supercomputer tools for studying how stars form and how planets evolve. His current work also focuses on life in the universe, the search for technosignatures of other exocivilizations, along with climate change and the astrobiology of the Anthropocene. A self-described evangelist of science, he is committed to showing others the beauty and power of science and exploring the proper context of science and culture. His last book, Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds, and the Fate of the Earth, received praise from the New York Times, NPR, and Scientific American. He has written 2 other books, The Constant Fire, Beyond the Religion and Science Debate, and About Time, Cosmology and Culture at the Twilight of the Big Bang. Adam is a regular on-air commentator for NPR's All Things Considered. He was co-founder of National Public Radio 13.7, Cosmos and Culture blog, which ran for 7 years. He's also a contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, and other media outlets. He currently runs the 13.8 blog on bigthink.com. Adam was also the science consultant for Marvel's Doctor Strange movie. Adam has appeared on many popular media outlets such as The Joe Rogan Show, CNN, The Today Show, and others. He has also appeared on a variety of national and international science documentaries such as Alien Worlds, Netflix 2020, Mars, Season 2, National Geographic, and The Universe on the History Channel. Adam received a number of awards for his scientific and outreach work. His book, Light of the Stars, won the 2019 National Honor Society Best Book in Science. In 2020, he was given the American Physical Society's Joseph A. Burton Forum Award. And this year, he was granted the Carl Sagan Medal for Excellence in Public Communication by the American Astronomical Society, which is why we're here today. So with that, I would like to yield the floor to Dr. Frank, and he's going to talk to us about what would Carl Sagan do. Take it away.
Thank you so much. So today, what I'd like to talk about is science communications, the state of science communications by scientists in this very bizarre era that we are in. Let me just start this, of really rampant science denial. So let us get started here. And okay. So before I start, though, I want to express my profound gratitude to the committee, which had to do the work of sorting through many people who deserved this award beyond myself. So thank you for all of that work and for choosing me. And also, I have to express my lifetime gratitude to my scientific advisor, Bruce Ballack, who's the one who taught me how to do science. And then also Casey Cole, who was my science writing mentor. Casey, I consider to be one of the finest science writers in the United States. And I really learned at her, at her knee about, how the proper craft of science writing. So thank you to them both. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to start off by saying, I really don't want to be an angry scientist. And it's a little difficult right now because of the strange world we're living in, where folks will use the fruits of science like a computer to, go use Facebook and, social media, while not really understanding how any of those parts work, from the internet to the chips in the computer, and using those fruits to then call other fruits of science, which they don't understand either, a hoax or a lie. So the fruits that, people are using happily are things like antibiotics, GPS, and Netflix. And then because of the strange political climate we're in, people think will use antibiotics, GPS, and Netflix, and then turn around and say, well, climate change, the measles vaccine, and COVID-19 are all hoaxes. The science surrounding those are all hoaxes. And, I don't really understand how computers work very well either, but, I sort of understand that science does this thing where I get benefits from it. And even if I don't understand it, I understand the benefits it gives. And so as a scientist, I am sort of angry that all the people who've done all this work to give you computers and such, that somehow there's this way in which people will use science and then turn around and then fail to, will call parts of science they don't like because for political reasons, they were told it was a hoax. So I want to I don't want to be, it's easy to sort of be angry about this and the state of things, but that's the wrong way to approach things. And that's what this talk is about. I want to talk about my own perspective and my journey through this route, the role that Carl Sagan played for me in this. And then, talk about science denial, the history of science denial in this country, the problems, the real profound problems it presents, and then ask, what would Carl do? So personal perspective, number one, I was raised in the New York, New Jersey metro area, and I fell in love with astronomy at age 5 because my dad had all these great pulp science fiction magazines in his library. And as a kid, I remember holding on, taking out covers like this and just sort of being like, oh my God, I need to be part of this. So I quickly became a super nerd, being both, deeply into science, but also science fiction, comic books, Marvel, etc. And throughout this, my principal hero when I was growing up was Carl Sagan. So here are 3 pictures of Carl Sagan. This one here is when he's very young. I believe this is when he's involved actually with the Mercury program, not the Mercury program, sorry, the Mariner program, the first interplanetary probes. This is at the Berkane SETI meeting in the mid 70s, I believe it was. And this is him later when, he'd become a world-renowned figure. And the book I first started with, I think my dad must have given me Braca's Brain. It was the first book I ever read. And I was captured by it. I was captured by his ability to explain science by embedding it in the narratives of what was happening with culture and art and politics. And it was a style of writing that I really felt I wanted to emulate. I knew after reading this book that not only was I in love with science, but I also wanted to tell other people about it. And the amazing thing about this, just as a little side note, is 50 years later, when I'm writing this book, Light of the Stars, which was about sort of thinking about climate change in terms of exoplanets, and I'm doing all this history, I want to tell these stories, I find Sagan everywhere. In Drake's 1961 interstellar communications meeting when the Drake equation is founded. Sagan was the first one to do the greenhouse calculation for Venus. He was part of the Mariner 2 and Mariner 9 teams. In 1984, he was part of the team that did the first nuclear winter calculations. He was in the room. He just happened to share an office with James Lovelock the moment that Lovelock sort of came upon the idea for Gaia. And then later on, he introduced Lovelock to Lovelock's longtime collaborator on Gaia theory, Lynn Margulis, who was Sagan's ex-wife. So it was just amazing later on to find that so many of my interests ended up dovetailing with his, or that I would find him at every corner. So, I'm also just want to say, to get the Sagan Medal is really touching to me because he has meant so much to me and obviously to millions of others. Okay, but continuing with my personal perspective, I'm growing up in New Jersey, loving science, but it is New Jersey, which means that everybody has a hustle. That's the most important thing about growing up in New Jersey. The movie American Hustle was, of course, about Jersey City. And so, one of the things you realize early on is that as, a survival mechanism is basically you have to be able to smell and respond quickly to, I shall call it malarkey rather than using a a curse word, but you know what I'm saying. Like, so you learn very quickly to see when somebody's trying to snow you. And this is one of the reasons I love science more, but it also means, sometimes with the science denial, I have very little patience for what's going on there. So then I go to graduate school. I begin graduate school in the mid and late 1980s. And during that time, that's when I begin moonlighting as a science writer, inspired by Sagan. And what I wanted to do in science writing was, first of all, talk to people, show people about science as a guide to finding public truths, that a society built around science and on science had a better shot at making wise decisions. And that meant also science as a guide to public good. And then finally, and most importantly, on a personal level, was that science, I wanted to show people that science was a guide to seeing and experiencing indescribable beauty, which is really, whether you're studying an ant colony or black holes or, the movement of electrons through a circuit, it's just indescribably beautiful. But what happens as, as I'm sort of doing more science writing, in 2010 or 2009, we start the writing for, we form the 13.8 Cosmos and Culture blog on NPR. And of course, because actually this is a longer story, but my first job before I even was in graduate school was actually at a climate facility, a NASA facility in New York City. And that's when I first learned about climate. So I was always interested in it. And so I wrote about it a lot. And I immediately began to see this network of denial showing up, where this was back in the day when you actually had comments, a comment section. And I'd write something about climate science. And very quickly, I'd start to see, and it got worse over time, sort of deniers showing up, and who were not really interested in discussing. They were just there to throw shade. They were there to call the science a hoax. And if you tried to engage them, in a friendly way, it didn't matter. They would, I received death threats. I was told I should be in a prison cell. I really began to get a taste for what science denial looked like. And I thought, as watching this happen, this is 2015, I always thought that denial would have a bottom, right? At some point, you can only deny reality so long before the consequences come at you. And so, I wrote this piece when there was this measles outbreak in Disneyland, right? Remember when measles was the worst thing we had to worry about with vaccines? And so I wrote this piece, thinking that, look, once people see the consequences of science denial, that'll put an end to it. But of course, came COVID, and we saw that really science denial didn't have a bottom, and it wouldn't matter how many people were showing up to a hospital. There was still the capacity to be able to deny what was happening as being, the science, as you see, the science is a hoax, COVID is a lie. So what is the correct approach to science denial? Well, if we're going to answer that question, first we have to ask what science denial is, how did it arise, and how does it fit into the history of America's relationship with science? So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about this. So, what's interesting about the United States as an experiment, the American experiment in government, is how closely science was aligned with that. The founders were all, quite enraptured by science and saw science as a hope for humanity. So Benjamin Franklin, of course, was one of the most famous scientists of his time. We all know of his experiments with electricity. But Thomas Jefferson, for example, said that the tranquil pursuit of science was his supreme delight. And if you ever get to go to the Library of Congress and look at Jefferson's library, you will see that he was not kidding about that. There's a lot of science books there. John Adams hoped that the Constitution would provide a way of having a science of government, a rationally governed free people. And then other members, the revolutionaries, Benjamin Rush, David Rittenhouse, were all themselves, or a number of them were actually scientists. And then this continues with this commitment to science. The National Academy of Sciences is founded by Lincoln in 1863. The U.S. Geological Survey, which was going to do a lot of science in its way, was founded in 1879. And then, of course, the First World War, but particularly the Second World War, is we really see we see that science really plays a fundamental role in beating fascism and winning that war. So everything from the development of radar the creation of synthetic rubber, obviously the development of the atomic bomb, and also the development of electronic computers. Even though it didn't make it into the war, it was, by the end of the war, that infrastructure had been put in place. So the perception is that science played and science and scientists played an integral role in beating back fascism and winning the Second World War. And based on this, Vannevar Bush, who was the head of the Wartime Office of Scientific Research and Development, is asked by President Roosevelt to propose a plan for continuing the wartime science effort into peacetime. And Bush writes what is, one of the most famous documents in American science policy called Science, the Endless Frontier. And it's from that, starting, in the late 1940s and onward, that the government becomes heavily invested in peacetime scientific research. So things like the National Science Foundation, NASA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the Department of Energy, this sort of salad bowl of or alphabet soup of acronyms gets formed, all of which, the United States starts pumping a huge amount of money into civilian science, obviously military science as well, but also into civilian science. And this is what I call the grand agreement, that science will provide the nation with tools for achieving prosperity and security, and then the nation will fund science, and here's the most important part, will leave it alone to pursue its studies and results. Scientists were expected to, police themselves, so to speak, in terms of, as they always have done, in terms of making sure their results are correct. And of course, that's the very nature of science. If your results aren't correct, you're going to find out pretty quickly. And so, this was the government and the scientific institutions wisely came to this agreement because they all remembered Lysenkoism, right? So the Soviet Union took an opposite path with its biology, where the Soviet Union biology was pretty much stopped by Lysenko, who had ideas that were at odds with Darwinism, and pretty much forced all of Soviet biology to toe that line. And in some sense, Russian biology never recovered from that. So, the leaders of the United States and United States science understood the dangers here in trying to have mixed politics with science and wisely kept away from it. Now, there were always roots of denial in American culture. There was, first of all, the evolution debate. We don't have to go into this too much, but there was, the famous Scopes monkey trial, where a teacher was brought on trial for teaching evolution, and that was pretty much seen as a victory for science. When eventually the culture came down on the side of science. But there was always, certainly in the 90s, we had the Discovery Institute pushing intelligent design, becoming more clever about how they would push back on scientific results. And then in the commercial sector, you had the Tobacco Institute, which was developing very shrewd ways of casting doubt, creating sort of shadow science and sowing doubt on scientific results. And that was the way you could hold off having any legislation that might restrict any kind of limits on tobacco. But really what happens is climate breaks that agreement. So in the 1990s, there is a concerted, well-funded effort at misinformation relative to climate science. That's when that begins. And it's, the well-funding comes, essentially from the fossil fuel industries, which had the most to lose because of this. And by the 2000s, this time when I'm starting to write, write for NPR, this denial really reaches public consciousness. So there's this faux climate gate. If you remember, there were some emails that were hacked, and the emails, didn't really show anything wrong, but it didn't matter in the court of public opinion, in the partisan nature of how these things were happening, the echo chambers. Climate gate became something that was seen to be important, even though there was nothing wrong. And this rises to higher levels of power, and it becomes, you have senators and such who are in this weird state where they're government officials who have to contradict their own scientists. And so the grand agreement is broken. Science is suddenly now, for some politicians, science is no longer in the public good if its results are antithetical to perceived political ends. And this induces this schizophrenia where government science is being called a hoax by the government. And so what was so terrifying was, and I tried to write about this back in 2009, is that it's a slippery slope. I don't know, some people thought that, well, we'll just call climate science a hoax and it'll stay there. But of course, once that cat's out of the bag, there's a lot of other things in that Pandora's bag. So with the rise of the internet, you again get things like the anti-vax movement. So formerly isolated groups find common ground. Long discredited papers like this paper about vaccines and autism by Andrew Wakefield live forever on Facebook, no matter how many retractions happen. And you get this rise of viral misinformation. And so, here's this one, a Facebook group that seems, so innocent, but in fact, actually, it's going to drive, it's going to end up driving a public health crisis that we haven't seen in a century. And so we end up with post-truth public discourse. So after 2015, you get an open challenge to the very idea that there can be any facts that we can agree upon, and that there are no means to find them. And this is a rejection of shared reality at the highest levels, even to the point where you look at these two pictures and say, which one of these has more people in it? The answer should be obvious. You can look at it yourself, but the denial will tell you that, your eyes are in fact, this evidence right here is in fact, the truth is different, or that there is no truth. Its truth is whatever you say it is. So, my thesis here is that this world of alternative facts that we've stumbled into actually required years of previous training of the public via science denial like climate change. I point a lot of this back to climate denial, but climate denial took a page from the Tobacco Institute and the Discovery Institute. And the problem here is that if you can't trust science, then there really is no authority or arbitrator of what is real and what is fake. And, that is terrible for your society if you are trying to be the world leader in technology. And it has real world consequences, right? This has the ultimate consequences of denying a shared reality, and the means to find it are well known. You end up with authoritarian governments that are masters of manipulating, of only allowing their version of reality. So, we know, I don't need to tell you about the dangers of this. But, even beyond this, or at least, given that this is a talk in a science setting, I'd also like to talk about the consequences of continued denial for American science, the institutions of American science. I also want to point out that Sagan saw this. This is The Demon Haunted World, one of his last books. And I'll just read very quickly. I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time, when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the key manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few, and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues, when people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, when clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties are in decline. Unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide, almost noticing, back into superstition and darkness. This was quite prophetic of Sagan, I believe. So let's just talk about science and the American scientific prospect. So, since World War II, the US scientific effort has been globally preeminent. We have an incredible system of public-private research universities combined with a very healthy government research laboratories. The university-based training system for educating the next generation of science is considered to be, one of the best in the world. And it draws a worldwide pool of talent. All of us who work in science know that we are seeing the best and brightest young minds from around the world want to come to the United States to study. And many of them will stay, and they will drive the vibrant private technology sector that has been the source of so much wealth creation. So, the important point is bright minds will go where they have the opportunity to do their best work in an environment of peace and freedom. And that has been the United States for quite some time. And if you look at, this is a list of recent US Nobel Prize winners, and I'm highlighting those who have been born elsewhere, who came from another country and made the United States their home. And it's, pretty remarkable. There's lots and lots of people are coming from other places to live in the United States and do their scientific work here, which clearly benefits the United States. But denial is a profound and even an existential challenge or threat for the American scientific prospect. No one is going to come here if we go down this road of scientific denial. And as has happened many times throughout history, the frontier, the baton of technological prowess, which drives economic expansion, will be handed to some other country, which is, willing to provide a fertile ground for science. After World War II, that really became the United States. And if we continue down this road, it won't be the United States. Now, some people could say, well, science itself bears blame. This is all because of, scientists are a bunch of egghead elites, who have lost the ability to communicate with the public. I think it's always worthwhile to ask about your own institutions. And certainly we have seen that the institutions of science have their own very long history of limiting who can and cannot participate in the activity. And this needs to be acknowledged and accounted for. We certainly need to see beyond our own horizons. But the beauty of the process of science itself, however, is open-ended and is always worthy of celebration, as we'll talk about. So what do we do about denial, right? So this is what I've learned from my many years of working, as a scientist who's a science communicator. The problem is not about scientific results. It's not about trying to show people another graph of why the temperature on the planet is changing. Most people don't think like scientists. We are trained in a very specific way of thinking. And what people really need help understanding is the method of science, why any result from science, why it carries a veracity with it that just other claims don't. And how those claims of veracity are always subject to change, right? But what some things are obviously more grounded than others. So what most people don't understand is how science works. So science is a very particular mode of reasoning. And just because you're highly educated doesn't mean that people are going to understand the multi-step reasoning that most scientists are used to. I remember talking to the editor of a very well-known media organization or a producer. We were talking about science, and they said to me, well, science doesn't really understand anything, really, right? And my jaw dropped, right? Because, this person had obviously gone to the finest schools and still didn't quite understand how science knows what it knows and knows what it doesn't know. So this is not just a matter of, whether or not you went to college. So in teaching people how science works, the media often really fails in this regard. Because what happens is, because of the nature of media, what we get is this sort of a new study shows, right? A new study shows on Monday, coffee's really good. A new study shows on Tuesday, coffee's really bad. And you see this bouncing back and forth. I love this one. A new study shows that even 25 cups of coffee a day isn't bad for your heart, right? And so this sort of new study-driven kind of news coverage just really makes people think like, well, science doesn't know anything, right? And part of this is, this is not necessarily just the media's fault, in the sense the media has its own issues, because newsroom science beats have been cut severely. There used to be almost every organization had a few people whose main job was covering science. These were dedicated journalists who both understood science and understood when science needed to be criticized as well. They really knew what was going on. Now there's often no science coverage at all, no one dedicated to it, but a kind of quote unquote news you can use, which is all health and technology, which means the public is not getting any chance to learn about how science actually works. So what do we do about this, right? What is the problem? And what I'm going to say is, I started off saying I do not want to be an angry scientist, even though I'm from New Jersey and anger comes very easily. You got to lead with the wonder, right? This is what I find, and I have found, is that, and this is really where Carl Sagan, led the way. I have these pictures of just the smiling Carl Sagan, because what I found is, going back and reading clips or looking at clips, and that no matter who he was dealing with, even with the most potent denier, he was always kind, and he always listened. He listened to their stories and listened to what they were saying, and he tried to respond with the sense that this was a human being on the other side. No matter what position they were taking, this was a person. And and Carl Sagan was going to do his best to let that person understand what made science special. So leading with wonder is what I believe is the right way to go. And let me just talk a little bit about that. So, there's so much, those of us who are scientists who are watching this, we all came to science because of wonder. And there's so many ways in which science on so many different scales and topics draws out that fundamental human experience of wonder. So for example, if you want to go beyond polarization, if you're facing someone who's anti-vax, or you're facing someone who thinks climate change is a hoax, before you ever bring up those issues, you might talk to them about the beauty of the night sky, the crazy plethora of macro scale life, all the different kinds of species we have, the insane mechanics of micro scale life. So here's this picture I have. Show them one of those incredible movies of motor proteins, how these nanoscale machines inside your cells that are moving, globlets of ATP around that literally look like dump trucks. Talk to them about black holes. Most of all, talk to them about aliens, because everybody loves aliens, right? Engage them with science, with what makes science special and interesting, and able to get that 9-year-old sensibilities before you ever go on to a polarizing topic. So I've had a lot of experience with this with my climate work, where before, if I'm going to go talk to an audience that I know is going to have people who are going to be hostile to climate, before I ever touch on climate, I'm going to talk about planets. Like, what do we know about planets? Well, let's talk about Mars. Mars is a planet that is entirely inhabited by robots, right? They're all our robots, but they're still robots. And show them pictures like this, which, could be the desert of Tunisia, but it's not. It's another planet. That there are all these other planets, that there are places to be, places you could walk, places, when we think about exoplanets where snow is falling, where there's oceans lapping up against shorelines. Start to build in their imagination that sense before you talk about what's happening on Earth. Talk about all of the other planets that we've discovered in the universe that are going to be habitable, that we found, if they count up 5 stars in the nighttime sky, one of them has a world orbiting it where the experiments in the possibilities of life and even civilizations are being run right now. Engage with them, get them to think about what that means, how many planets, trillions and trillions of planets in the known universe where that experiment is being run right now. And then begin to talk to them about, sort of what we understand about planets, how we can actually tell something or about the climate. We may be able to tell something about the climate conditions on these planets very soon. Talk about, before I'm going to talk about how human beings have changed the atmospheric chemistry, I'll ask them to take a deep breath and ask them, where did the oxygen in the atmosphere come from? And then I'll tell them the story of the great oxidation event, how the Earth, if they'd landed on Earth 3 billion years ago, there would have already been lots of life on the planet. And if they walked out of their spaceship and took off their space helmets, the first thing that would happen is they'd die from asphyxiation. Because even though there was a blue sky, there was not a oxygen-rich sky. So I'll tell them about how microbes, how this incredibly successful form of life actually created the oxygen atmosphere. And in doing so, made conditions very difficult for themselves. And I'll say, like, does that sound familiar, right? I'll be able to use the history of the Earth as a way of showing them that, look, climate change, it's not a hoax. You should have expected climate change. When we look at the history of the Earth, we've seen life change the atmosphere many times. Given what we're doing, given the successes that we've had, we should have expected climate change. Now, are we smart enough to be able to deal with it? And I'll often show them this picture, and I'll ask them, which of these is the Earth? And of course, it's a trick question, because they're all the Earth. They're all the Earth at different eras in its history. So this is the Earth in the Hadean, when there was a magma ocean. This is the Earth before the continents really had grown. In many ways, it was a water world. There was periods of the Earth periods of the Earth's history where it's basically a jungle world where the temperatures were so high there was no snow anywhere. It has been a snowball world where the glaciers covered almost the entire surface of the planet. And then, of course, there's our beautiful globe now. And then, wait long enough and the oceans are going to boil away. And, you start talking to people about this before you get into anything which they're going to hook their polarized sensibilities. and they'll come to understand that this is climate change is a scientific question. What we do about it is a political question, is a policy question, but the mere fact about whether it's happening or not gets set into this long, long history of the Earth's evolution. And it is a history that can stir awe and wonder. So the question is, and I'm coming to the end here, is there a bottom to scientific denial, right? That was one of the questions I asked early on. And the answer, of course, is always yes, because nature always gets the last laugh, right? If we continue down this path, as a planet, obviously, we're going to trigger a kind of climate change that's going to make our project of civilization difficult to maintain. But it's also, we're going to, even if before that happens, the United States will lose its scientific preeminence. We will no longer be the leader of the world economically or any other way, because we will have lost our capacity to lead in science. And of course, we don't want to go there. That is, yes, there is a bottom, but none of us wants to visit that bottom. So do we have to hit the bottom? And the answer, I think, is no, because as I've shown you, science is built into the American DNA. It's not there's a reason why Carl Sagan was American. The optimism, the boundless optimism, the wonder, the joy, the joy from science, I think is something that, obviously everyone around the world has this, but there's a way in which it's really built into the American personality. We do impossible things. And science has always been a source of inspiration and challenge for Americans, and it's always been available to teach us as a people. So I don't think we have to hit bottom. I don't think this story is written in any way. What do we do? How do we keep from getting there? Well, as we said, we do what Carl would do. That is lead with wonder. And this image is actually from a commercial for a car that actually used Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, to get this commercial, they actually, the car company, spent an enormous amount of money, dedicated it to environmental, policies that would, fight climate change. So lead with the wonder, and I believe in that way, our best days will be ahead of us. But we should understand the challenges that are before us now. So I'll end there, and I thank you all very, very much for giving me some of your time.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. I enjoyed that a lot. So anyone who is out there listening, please type your questions into the YouTube chat, and they will be relayed to us, and we will try and answer them as many as we have time for. To get the ball rolling, I guess what I'm left with is, how do we tackle the political aspect of it, and people who are maybe trying to lead in misinformation?
Yeah, I think that is, as you said, who are leading with misinformation. I think that has to actually be called out directly. And here's actually, if you allow me to go a little bit forward, I have a slide which is very relevant to this. This is the court documents for the case that was being brought by Semantic, a voting machine company, against Fox News and a number of the lawyers that were responsible for sort of pushing what they call the big lie. And I love the way this starts. It says, the introduction to this suit begins, the earth is round, 2 + 2 = 4. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won the 2020 election. The election was not stolen, rigged, or fixed. These are facts, demonstrable and irrefutable. I think it's so interesting that they started this, this suit with two scientific facts. One, which is an astronomical fact, and the other, which is a mathematical fact. So I think, part of the process here is not being afraid to call out what is happening, right? Because things can get bad, right? I mean, that's, I think, what we need to understand, but we have to be willing, and, but doing it in a way that makes it clear that what we're defending is science. We're not taking a political position on something, we may all have our own feelings about fiscal policy, or immigration policy, but that's not what we're talking about here. right? That's not what when we engage in these debates, we're engaging in a debate of solely about how do you judge, what are standards of evidence? How do you discuss in particular science? So I think we have to call out the purposeful deceit when we see it, but we have to keep focused and not get drawn into other things, into places where people are going to have, rightfully policy differences. Yeah, policy differences are fine, but it's the idea of whether or not what is the basis on which you ask about reality, ask about the real world in which these policy debates can occur, and where they are scientific issues like climate change or vaccines. We have to be very clear, but also never give way to hatred, right? Never give way, because that never works. It just never works. And so always, no matter who you're talking to, you got to treat them as a human being, right? You got to treat them and recognize them as a human being, motivated by whatever they're motivated by.
Yeah, that sounds challenging, but necessary.
Right.
Great. So we do have a question from the YouTube chat. Thanks for the great presentation. What do you think is the path forward? More engagement by scientists with the public, political action, better countering misinformation on social media? And you touched a little bit about some of those.
Well, can I have all of the above? John, each of us has to decide what we're going to do. Countering, I find social media to be a black hole of despair, and I would not put a whole lot of effort into getting into a debate on Twitter with someone, who's anti-vax or anti-climate. It is a pointless exercise in frustration, because you're never going to convince anybody. You're speaking actually into an echo chamber, and it doesn't do any good. So in that sense, I wouldn't waste my time there. What you really want to do, I've had this idea for a while I called it the science project, which is to get scientists to go out and talk to people, right? Particularly people who don't normally meet scientists. It's amazing I'm sure many people have had this experience. You're a scientist, you got on an airplane and you're sitting down and you start talking to somebody. They're like, what do you do? It's like, oh, well, I'm an astronomer. And they're like, oh, what is that? Oh, you're an astrologer. Like, no, I'm an astronomer. Oh, you're a cosmeticist. And they're like, no. And people really just don't know what it is that scientists do. What's really interesting is there was a poll a bunch of years back where they asked people, how they felt about scientists. And what was really heartening is that people really respected science. They trusted scientists. They really respected, overall, like 70%. But they also said, I love this one. They said, do you think scientists are like you in terms of their feelings and emotions? And the response was like, no, scientists do not have feelings and emotions. Scientists are all, it's like, well, where did that come from? It came from the media, right? From, 10,000 bad science fiction movies. So I think it would be really great if we had science emissaries who were going out into places where, places that don't see scientists normally, going into particularly places where there is a lot of science denial. And you know what? Give a whole talk just about exoplanets. And at the end, mention climate change. Just drop a little bit of water, a little ink in the water. Let them know that all the science I've been showing you that you think is totally cool about aliens, well, it's the same science we use for climate change. It's not like we have a special science that we haul out, that's full of hoaxes. Now we're going to do climate science. Let's bring out the hoaxy science, right? Let them see that this is, that it's all part of the same thing. The science that they're using for their GPS is the same science that is being used to determine whether vaccines are health safe or not. So I think if anything, I would say the best thing we can do is actually just get out in front of people. And that can, what's really amazing is how the things have changed since Carl Sagan's era. So when I was an undergraduate at the University of Colorado, and this is like 1984, I remember going to my favorite science professor, my favorite physics professor, who I was taking E&M with. And I was talking to him, and I mentioned Carl Sagan, how much I loved Carl Sagan, and his eyes rolled, right? Big eye roll. And I was like, and he kind of, I was like, oh, Carl Sagan, And I was really bummed out that wow, why wasn't Carl Sagan getting any love? And And that's because at the time he was the only one doing it, and people saw it as being beneath scientists to do that. But now there's a million channels to which to be a science communicator. You can, become a science communicator without being a scientist. You can just love science. Lots of people do this. You see these on YouTube, really expertly done things where people just want to share their own enthusiasm with science. And if you're a scientist and you want to do science communications, look at like David Kipping's channel. It's just one that I know of. David Kipping, the Cool Worlds series. It's just beautifully done. So there's a zillion different ways that we can all be involved in whichever way makes sense. And then finally, as you said, activism. I think activism, we gotta, writing stuff for newspapers, for media outlets, making sure you're getting out there, campaigning, voting on everything from the level of your school board meetings, your water board meetings, like with students. I often, when I give talks, students will tell me how depressed they are about what's going on. And I'm like, you got to vote. And they're like, oh, what, once every 4 years? I'm like, no, every week. There's always something you can get involved in your community. And, especially dealing with climate change, it's going to start at your local water commission. What kind of policies are they putting in and building up? So all of the above, except social media.
Thanks for that. I want to actually follow back on something that you mentioned in your previous answer about all the, dozens of bad sci-fi movies. And what role do you think that the entertainment industry plays in some of this science accuracy, and how does your work as a consultant fit into that?
Well, the interesting thing is that I think, there is lots of terrible science fiction, but normally, I don't really care whether somebody gets the science right in a science fiction movie. Like, I'm not going to criticize Star Wars because, the laser, the laser goes across the entire galaxy and blows up another planet. Because, that's not what Star Wars is about. There's lots of bad science fiction that's just bad because it's terrible storytelling. But what is interesting is, and Marvel, I feel, has really led the way with this. That there's now, and you see this, there's the national, I think it's the National Academy of Sciences Science Exchange. What Hollywood has recognized is that actually their stories will be better if they have a scientist involved, because reality is way more cool and inventive than they are. So there's been a number of physicists like myself who've done work for Marvel and other production companies. So I think in a lot of ways, what's most important for the media is that they communicate the wonder of science, right? That they don't fall into tropes of scientists being, evil, wanting to
robots,
having no emotions. Yeah, right, robots. But actually, and this is what I thought Marvel did really well. Marvel is a science universe, and science is treated with respect, and the people who do science are treated with respect. I mean, there's evil scientists in there too, but in general, science is held in esteem in that, as it rightfully should be. So that's the most important thing for the industry to do. And I'm seeing a lot more of that, and it's very heartening.
Great. Here's another question from YouTube, from Josh's Bookish Voyage. You present the problem as a lack of understanding in science, but there are still scientists who succumb to pseudoscience, from GMOs to nuclear energy. So how do we tackle it in our own community?
Oh, well, that's an excellent question. Well, the thing is, and this is where, I'm going to go to this slide. I once did this this thing for NPR. It was really fun, where I was trying to tell people how scientists works. And I talked about the 3 S's, that science was basically about spitballs, super tankers, and stadiums. And the spitballs was the idea that, every scientific paper is a spitball, right? And it's only, and so when a new study comes out saying a new study shows that, you can drink motor oil and you'll be fine. It's like, it's just one study, unless you get lots and lots and lots of studies that say the same thing, then you really don't have science hasn't reached a conclusion yet. And that's why science is like a super tanker. It takes 7 miles to turn a super tanker. Science is like that. All the spitballs have to align on one side that, yes, drinking motor oil is bad for you, and then eventually you'll see the super tanker turn. And then also that the super tanker doesn't have a captain, it's got a stadium's worth of captains, which is the entire scientific community. And so when you have people, who are, are have views that are very much in contrary to the consensus. I mean, look, the nature of science is that's fine. There's nothing wrong with people, and actually sometimes, very rarely those people will be right. But what you have to point out, if they're going to become public figures, what you have to force them to acknowledge is that they are contrarians, and that they are not, what force them to admit, and they will, the good ones will do this, that, their view is a minority view and nobody else holds it. And then if they try to say, well, nobody believed Galileo, then you say to them, oh, so you're Galileo, right? And that often shuts that one down, right? Pretty easily. So, I think, there's absolutely a right to have contrarian science. There's a place for contrarian science, but when those contrarians become public figures and use their PhDs to try and affect public policy, that's a different subject. And there they need to be held accountable in this way of like, they know how science works. And either they're claiming that they're super geniuses above everybody else, or they have to acknowledge that, yeah, this is my minority opinion.
Thank you. So I'll put out a last call for more questions on YouTube. In the meantime, so I think I missed what's the stadium part? Oh, the drivers are the stadium. That's
yeah. And again, this is the thing this is the biggest problem for the public, because, and of course, this is not the public's fault. Science is this, that's the whole point of, 6 years of graduate training. Science is this very particular way of thinking about the world. You have to be trained. Science is one of the last places where mentorship actually still exists, where you really, you sort of learn at the knee of an older scientist who hopefully is a nice person. And you learn this craft. And so, it's very, very foreign to most people. And the nature of its specialization is why it's so incredibly effective, right? It's the rigor and the sort of, being willing to spend, 50 hours trying to make sure that this one little blip in your results, you understand it. This is not really the way most people are going to go about their lives. And so we really need to show people what that method is, why that method is so effective, right? Because people don't understand, well, why should I believe you? Why should I believe science? And you'd think it would be enough to say like, well, did you take antibiotics the last time you got you got an infection? But somehow there's this big disconnect, and you got to show people how this, as I like to always say to people, science is exciting and it's incredibly boring, right? Because it requires, just unending, tedious, mind-numbing hours of work. But that's why you get an airplane that flies and doesn't drop out of the sky. So these things have to be made explicit in our dialogue with people who aren't scientists. And again, to recognize that it's not because they're stupid, they're very smart. They're smart in what they're smart in. And they're smart in the things they've been trained in. There's lots of things that I'm incredibly stupid about that I need somebody else to come, fix parts of my house or whatever. So I think, understanding that the methodology of science, getting people to really understand and how it's present in their lives, in their day-to-day lives, making those explicit connections. Like one of the things when I get into arguments with anti-vaxxers is, people will be like, well, this hasn't been tested. I said, well, have you taken medicine from a doctor recently? And they'll, say yes, unless they're being, ornery. They'll say yes. And I'll say, do you know how much that was tested? How many? Because, a lot of times, if they're getting a new medicine, that medicine actually hasn't been tested all that much, especially compared to the vaccines. And so letting them see that, look, you're living in a world of science. You're making 10,000 decisions every day using science. You just don't know it. And it just doesn't make sense, or doesn't make a whole lot of sense to pick this one thing and suddenly say like, oh, that I don't believe, right? So I think we just have to try and draw that out for people.
All right, so I think this will be our last question. Cody Halfmoon asks, what is the best way to get people excited about scientific progress and research in astronomy? Like how do you take that wonder and actually get people excited about it?
Meet them where they are, right? So what I find is the thing that I can always get whenever I sit down on an airplane and somebody asks me what I do, and I tell them, if I'm really in a grumpy mood and I don't want to talk to anybody, I tell them I'm a physicist.
That's what I was just thinking.
if you tell them you're an astronomer,
Right.
there's two questions. One, what's inside a black hole? And two, aliens. So if you really want to get people excited, talk about aliens, because everybody loves aliens. You know what? Talk about the UFOs and the UAPs, just like engage. I mean, the UAPs, look, there is some interesting stuff with the UAPs. I don't think it has anything to do with aliens, but it's a mystery right now that needs to be investigated scientifically. So you can get into this whole conversation with people, even if they're like, unless they're completely, out there UFOologists, engage them about like, well, what do we know about alien life? And how do we know about other planets? And how do we know, isn't life amazing? And you can talk about what you know about, the stuff that the alien life in your own body, the microbes and the incredible cells, things that seem, so amazing that they almost are like aliens. So again, find out where they're at and then meet them there. What I often ask people is, what do you do? What do you do for a living? This one time, and this guy, he was an insurance adjuster, and I started talking about probability, and just like going into that, like, well, how do those rates set? Find out what they know, and then build on it, and be curious about them. Right? This is something my stepdad was a civil rights leader and a politician in Newark, New Jersey. And he was an amazing guy. And he was always able to see, even with his most dire political enemies, he always saw them, could see where they were coming from. And he always told me, why am I telling you the story? He always said to me, when you meet people, ask them about their lives. If you want to make a connection, just ask them, what do they do? And then what you'll find out is where the places are that they find wonder in their lives. And meet them there. And that can be, potent, a really potent way. Because everybody's got a story. We all have stories, and, we're all the center of our own little universes.
Right. Yeah, that sounds really effective. I think that, I found that just talking with people as well, right? If you talk with them about something that they're interested in, then they're much more receptive to it. Yeah. So that's great advice. Thank you so much. So I think we're getting to the end of our time. Is there anything else you want to say? Any final remarks or comments?
Only that I don't want to it's funny because I often, when I do interviews and things, people, especially about when my last book with climate and the future of civilization and life on planets, people would always ask me, am I hopeful? Oh, are you hopeful? Do you think we're going to make it? And I'm a hopeful guy, so I always gave hopeful answers. Recent events have made me think a little bit about the answers I give, and especially to young people, right? And what I really, I don't think we should underestimate the challenge that we face, the times that we live in, and that's just the way it is, right? I mean, that we need to recognize the challenge that's before us, and that we need to have sort of gird our loins, so to speak, that's a weird word, but harden, or stiffen our backs for what may be coming. Because, when you read history, people go through all kinds of things, and it can be really hard, and you got to just understand that your time that you're born is the time that you're born, and you have to do the best with it and find the joy that you can in it. And then, and in the end, science does win. In the end, beauty does win. It may take a while, but, you just got to be committed to the process. What I often tell people is from the Lord of the Rings, right? You've got Mount Doom there behind you. That line when Frodo says, now I'm really nerding out now, Frodo says, like, I don't want to carry the ring, man. This ring is terrible. And Gandalf says, like, it's not for us to decide. It's not for us to decide what what times we live in, but what we do in the times that we live. And so, I don't want to paint, like a rosy picture. It's all going to be great. But, I think we're Americans, and we have the capacity to do amazing things, and we will do amazing things. So that's where I'm at.
Great. Thank you so much. This was a really informative talk. I enjoyed it so much. So this talk will be on YouTube, and people can go back and view it again later. You can find Adam on Twitter, as much as he said he doesn't like social media. No, like, you didn't say you didn't like it, but
No, I use Twitter. I just don't get into, I just don't get into arguments with people on Twitter.
Sure.
It's like, life is short, you know?
Sure. And yeah, so thanks so much. And congratulations again on your Sagan Medal. And all of us at DPS and at Lowell, we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for, it's such an honor. I'm deeply grateful.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.